thank you everybody for showing up. Today's going to be the first of hopefully a series of an AMA with Kochava Foundry and myself, Grant Simmons, the VP of Foundry. And today we're going to talk about iOS. And so I really encourage everybody, ask questions. We got a bunch of questions already. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And as we go through this today, I encourage everybody to put some questions in the prompt over on the right-hand side. We'll get to them. And in terms of what we're going to talk about today, we're recording the webinar. And again, please ask questions and pepper us. We have about 7 or 8 questions that we received already, and we'll get to those at the end. We also have the Docs tab over on the right-hand side, and I'll be referring to some of that stuff because there's some really good material in terms of what's going on with iOS and some resources in terms of what to do and how to do it. And then finally, follow us on social. You got our Facebook, our X, LinkedIn. We don't have threads up there. I'm not sure anybody's on X anymore, but we're also on threads, so follow us there. So again, thanks everybody for the pre-questions. We'll put them up and have a pretty good discussion after we get through the initial presentation. And feel free to just ask questions along the way. I'll be monitoring the chat as we go. It feels like I need like another 3 screens set up, so sort of bear with me, but we'll certainly get through everybody. We got some folks from Georgia. Nice, thank you for the late attend here. Appreciate it. All right, let's jump in. And so a lot of you have probably heard this first part already, and if you have, feel free to tune out. But we're going to take a little trip down memory lane. We're actually going to go back to WWDC in 2020, and what was announced at that time was the introduction of the AppTrackingTransparency in the SKADNetwork. And so what happened? What was announced? Well, what was announced was unless consent is captured via Apple's AppTrackingTransparency framework, then no user nor device information shall be used for the purposes of targeting and measurement, full stop. And so largely that was pointed at the identifier for advertisers, or the IDFA. Hold on, receive a note here real quick. I'm supposed to click hide on something real quick. What am I supposed to click hide on here, Jeff? Apologies here for the folks playing at home. On the screen share. Let me try the screen share again. All right, is that better? All right, we're better. Apologies. So what was announced was no user nor device information shall be used for the purposes of targeting measurement. And so we expected the deprecation of the IDFA, or the UUID4 identifier. And so on Android devices, there's the ADID. On Android devices, there's the IDFA, or identifier for advertisers. And so what happened? Well, we have different types of match types and attribution types. And again, let's get back to why does a brand use an MMP, right? So let's say you've got an app. You as the advertiser use our SDK in your app such that you can hear conversions in real time. And then separately, we have 250 control servers sprinkled all over the planet so that your marketing teams can come into the platform and build tracking campaigns to say, hey, publisher, when somebody sees your ad or clicks your ad, these are the tags you use. And so we hear that at real time. We hear the conversions in real time. And to the extent that you have a custom attribution waterfall, we respect that and we generate that answer. We do all of that, close that loop within 120 milliseconds. That is largely gone away, at least within the SKADNetwork framework. And so in terms of other match types, what was the effect? Well, we expected IDFA to deprecate. And so back in the day, it was about 27% of attribution total. Out of all the iOS attributions we saw, about a quarter were attributed to the IDFA, or a deterministic match. And you can see that's now roughly about 8%. So if we look at the next match type, which is probabilism, and probabilism has historically been known as fingerprinting, which was the absolute dumbest thing we could have ever called it. Because if you think about a fingerprint, it is truly unique. You can't get rid of them unless you go through like some wild exercises, and is truly unique to individual. And that's not really true with fingerprinting in digital, whereby it typically used or uses an IP and user agent concatenation to figure out, it's probably the same device. However, that went away again with the introduction of AppTrackingTransparency and the SKADNetwork. And so while we still see lots and lots of probabilistic match types, if we were to look back here and let's say the beginning of 2021, this was about 3/4 new user activity. So this was networks and publishers, third-party publishers, using smart links and making probabilistic matches to match to conversions. If we look at probabilism now, it is exclusively owned media. And so now we see, even though probabilism is a match type, hasn't really changed that much in terms of percent, the makeup of it has. And what it tells me is folks are relying more on their owned media than they ever have been before. And so that's sort of takeaway number one. If maximize your owned media to the extent possible, because it's the one thing that'll keep you buying back your same customer again and again and again. And as much as you can hydrate your own first-party data throughout the ad tech funnel, it's to your benefit, particularly in iOS. So that's IDFA, that's probabilism. If we go up to the next one, that's self-attributing networks. Self-attributing networks, you know, if you think sort of across the board, Meta, Google, AppCampaign, Twitter, Snapchat, Yahoo, a handful of others. That alone accounts for about 65% of attribution total across the board, right? And we can see what the changes in Apple privacy did to the self-attributing networks. This alone was largely Facebook back in the day, and then it got squeezed out. TikTok leaned into SCAD heavily. They started to gain some market share through here. But ultimately, you can see it's a much different world for the self-attributing networks now versus what it was 2 years ago. And the next thing we see is SCAD. Here comes SCAD. It's been around for a long time, but adoption wasn't really there. And so we can basically say we didn't really see any SCAD up until about April of 2021. And even though WWDC 2020 announced the SKAdNetwork and the AppTrackingTransparency framework, nothing really happened for almost a year. And there was a 2-week period between April and May of 21 where we were seeing few operating systems that could carry the prompt, and then suddenly, boom, about 95% of the devices we saw could carry the AppTrackingTransparency prompt. And so you can see that was right in this period where IDFA starts to get deprecated. Just going to see if we have any questions here real quick. Yeah. Hey, Jeff, if you're listening, you might have to help me out with these questions. It looks like we got some flowing in. If you want to hit me up on Slack, and you can just start peppering them to me while I go through this. So let's look at the prompt itself and how's prompting changed over time. And so when we talk about the prompt and attribution on iOS, there's really only 2 games in town. There is either you got consented prompt on the advertised and the advertising entity. And assuming you have those 2 things, you can make a deterministic match. If you don't, you have to use the SKAN network. And so right now are more folks prompting than previously. If we go back to Q1 of 2022, about 17% of the apps we saw were prompting. And that's up quite a bit. It's up quite a bit. It's almost doubled to 29%. And so if we think about what's the overall effect been, well, if we were to take of those that were prompted, what percent opted in is 44.2%. And so if you were to take everything, say, of what was prompted, and we got an IDFA for on both sides, it rolls to a 6.8%. And that was last year. That is now rolling to an 11.6%. And the interesting thing to me here is we've sort of crossed a 50% Rubicon in the last year. More folks, when presented with the prompt, are willing to accept it. Maybe that the messaging itself's become a little bit better. As much as any of us can sort of play with that language, as long as there's a value proposition, folks will opt in. Might be that they're inured to it, much like the GDPR prompt for web cookies. So it's hard to say, but if we were to take this and we look at it sort of by by vertical, we can see sort of across the board. And you know, this is largely our version of the world, not the world, but it's probably a pretty good proxy. And things that we're particularly deep in are things like music and travel, games very deep in, social we're pretty deep in. And generally across the board, you can see that the take rates for app tracking transparency are generally up. And in some places where like gaming's up quite a bit. So the question is, well, what does this come to, right? Like, what's the overall upper bound of the capture that we could possibly grab? And so let's look by geo also. So this is across the world, and we have pretty good representation across the board. I highlighted North America just because we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And again, it's up across the board. If you were to ask me, what is the overall opt-in rate roll to? It doesn't go to 50 and it doesn't go to 0. I think probably 25 to 30% is probably the upper bound we'll find. It varies by vertical, it varies by geo, it varies by offer, but I think 30% is probably the upper bound. And so what does that mean? It means that, in terms of retargeting, in terms of suppression, in terms of trying not to target the same customer and get a beat on them so that you don't serve a media because you already did or they did something that was convertible within your universe. The consent's really the game in town. And so as much as you can get your consent up, makes retargeting and suppression easier. So, but at the end of the day, if we were to go back to this graph, Apple as a publisher tool is now about 67% of iOS attributions. It's either going to be Apple search ads or it's coming through the SKAdNetwork. So we looked at verticals, we looked at geos. Let's look at the networks themselves. And so where are the publishers in all this? And so this is just a volume trended of SCAD conversions over time. It's not broken out by SCAD version type. We'll look at that here in a little bit. But these are all of the publishers that are attributing to SCAN conversions. And what we see here is, if we were looking at some of this volume back here, there were some DSPs that leaned in pretty heavily. And then here come the self-attributing networks. And so Kochava has 4,500 network integrations. In terms of the networks that we're seeing integrated with SCAN and sending SCAN conversions, it's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, call it 7, that are actually really leaned in, right? And so, and again, the self-attributing networks are sort of taken away with it here, where, and many of you brands are experiencing the modeling they're doing versus what, let's say, SCAD's observing, trying to understand the mismatch between those two, trying to mitigate your null values and trying to understand just generally, hey, what sort of aggregation do I need to get to visibility? I guess it's probably no surprise that the self-attributing networks would be the ones that would have the volume and scale to be able to sort of do that well. I'm still holding out hope for the integrated DSP universe though. But as of right now, they're losing to the SANs. If we look at SCAN versions, we started with SCAN 1.0. And like that Google DV360, it was on SCAN 1.0 for a while, and then they didn't really update it until even, end of last year. It's sort of been lagging. But if we look sort of across the board, how do these versions roll out? We're on SCAN 5.0 right now. The Kochava SDK is dialed in for SCAD 5.0 to look at coarse and fine grain values and things like that. But if we look at the world of SCAN, it's largely 3.0. We're starting to see some 4 flood in. This will probably overtake this about this time next year, and then we'll start to see 5, and we'll probably be talking about 6. And so my takeaway here is the publishers have generally been, at least from my experience, lagging the advertisers. And so this can be remarkably challenging when you're trying to understand different SCAD version types across a different publisher base. And so we'll talk about a SCAD consult down below and some things there, but suffice to say, this can be very, very confusing for folks if you're trying to understand different SCAN values across different publishers. So ideally, we get to a point where this becomes a lot more standardized. There's a lot less changes between SCAN versions, right? The comparability of SCAN 1 to 4 is not a thing. Even 2 to 4 is difficult. And so hopefully we get to sort of a homogeneous state where this becomes more standardized and we start to make sense of it a little bit better. Let's talk about sort of mobile all over, just sort of overall though. And I think it's important to note when we look at the world is largely Android. And so if we look at all attribution types worldwide, most of it's Android. Android is 73% of the footprint worldwide. iOS about 27%. However, that changes when you move into the US, right? Within the US, it's 56% iOS in terms of handsets. And so I think it's important to note, though, when we talk about mobile marketing, it's mostly Android devices. And in fact, it's mostly Android devices being marketed to on Google properties. And so Google UAC, or Google App Campaign, and Android actually describe most of mobile marketing. And so why are we spending so much time talking about iOS? Shouldn't we be spending more time talking about Android? Well, the reality is that if you're a brand in the US, iOS is what matters. Average handset coverage in the US is 56% of total. And so many of the brands over-index well above that 56%. And so when we think about attribution against that 56% or greater, there's really only 3 games in town. You got consent, and you got consent via the AppTrackingTransparency framework. And so you can do full deterministic attribution. If you don't receive it on the publisher or advertiser side, then you have to rely on the SKAdNetwork, where that notion of real-time conversions and real-time ad signals generating real-time post-backed answers has to be delayed, aggregated, and obfuscated somewhat. And then finally, there's this thing that is Apple search ads, which again use entirely different containers on the device for the purpose of attribution. But the nice thing about Apple search ads is you can make a deterministic match between an Apple clicked keyword and performance in an app. And so Apple does some really neat things here. One thing they do is when you tap the search term, that keyword bundle in a code is written to the app binary and is available for the MMP to pick up. And we can submit it via API to Apple to find out what that keyword is. What does that mean? It means that we have a distinct keyword that we can tie to not just an install, but it could be a post-install event like a registration or hamburgers purchased in the app or episodes watched in the app. And that's a deterministic match that can be made. So to the extent, and I'm sure, if you're an Apple heavy brand, I guarantee you're probably marketing on Apple search. Strong recommendation to find out all the opportunities there. Apple stood up some really neat APIs. You can get tons and tons of visibility. And it, again, is a totally different attribution type, again, versus what's in the SKAdNetwork. Lots of opportunities in Apple search ads. And so Apple's really, really important, particularly to US brands. And so a lot of this work relies on what's happening within the bit protocol model. What is that? The bit protocol model, I'm actually going to pull up another piece of content here real quick. Yeah, let me share this guy. I'll share this sort of in an unpretty manner. But I want to talk about what happens with the SKAdNetwork real quick. And there's a container on an Apple device called update conversion value. And every time update conversion value is written to, it starts a 24-hour timer. Once that first 24-hour timer expires, it starts another random 24-hour timer. And when that random 24-hour timer expires, the postback's generated. And what's sent on the postback is what was written to the update conversion value. And so effectively, you have 63 combinations to describe the relationship between your paid media and your conversion activity. And that takes place with an 8-bit container called the update conversion value. And so you can think of 64 combinations within those 8 bits. That is called the bit protocol model. And it becomes you can think of it as Rosetta Stone, by which you can understand all of your media relative to your conversions, in this case, in your app. And so you have to be really thoughtful about it, meaning, well, if we were historically attenuating and optimizing to, let's say, a purchase event, and that purchase event is preceded by a trial event, which is preceded by a registration. Well, if we wait 10 days to attenuate to the purchase event, well, now we have to wait a little bit longer for timers to expire. And then we have to wait for enough of those conversions to aggregate up such that a postback will be generated. And so the feedback loop takes longer and is more obscure. The first thing that I tell folks is try to maximize as much intelligence as you can within that bit protocol. We have some off-the-shelf models, and I can run through them really quick. You've got highest event value. You can think of that as sort of like funnel metrics. You start with an install, and then you go to find out more, and there's a registration, there's a loyalty sign-up, maybe a purchase event, but there's some sort of funnel activity that's expected. How far did they get down that funnel within the time frame? You can think of user journey, which is what are all the different things they did in my app, and when a certain combination happens, I want to know about it. You've got revenue, and so for the advertiser clients that pipe revenue into our house, we can build models directly against revenue. And then you've got engagement, which is typically the same activities or events happening again and again and again. How many happened within the time frame? Only about 10% of models are custom, and I think that's going to increase dramatically because there is a lot of flexibility within the bit protocol. But a quarter of folks attenuate to just the install, and which is, I understand why folks do it because they need to close that feedback loop as soon as possible, but they're unfortunately losing a lot of quality information, and which keywords are attributing to, or excuse me, which media is attributing to more accretive customers can be really hard to understand if you're running an install only model. And so it's because of this complication is why, a little shameless plug here. We spend a lot of our time doing SKAdNetwork consults. And so if you can think about this against your brand, it's a few different things. Just like the industry as a whole has had a pattern of attribution and waterfall match type changes, it's the same for your brand. Let's take a look. From that alone, recommendations tend to flow. The second thing is we look at the bit protocol model and understand if we're getting the right completeness out of it versus the right timeliness. And that's the first sort of spectrum balance that has to be struck. Do I want to wait for a longer time to get a better answer, or am I better served getting a good enough answer right now? And that's a decision that has to be made. There's some data that can be brought to that story to help understand it. Understand lock windows, coarse, fine-grained values, multiple conversions. It's a little bit different for every brand. We take a look and actually figure out those concatenations that make the most sense in terms of describing your media efficacy. The other interesting thing we can do is sort of a reverse lookup to find out the apps that are advertising your ads. And oftentimes you'll have multiple network publishers, same sub-publisher, and 2 or 1 is performative. And so it gives you some options on what to maximize and what to potentially cut at the publisher level, because we can actually interrogate and get back the app that was doing the advertising. And then finally, we look at your distribution. So is it a mix of 1, 2, 3, and 4? Are you mostly 3? Are you 3 and 4? And depending upon that combination, there's certain inferences and combinations that can be combined and some that you don't want to do. And so this is us taking a look at basically your brand and all of the attribution through it. So with that, I'm going to stop. That's the big setup. That's what's happening on iOS. And right now, I'm going to stop the screen share. I'm going to go to some questions here real quick. And again, this is such an interesting exercise because it's like I'm talking to myself. But hopefully, y'all are learning something. All right, let me go to some questions here real quick. We received a bunch of really good ones. And I wanted to start specifically with the folks at Depth had asked a really good question. I just had talked about fine and coarse grain values, and it looks like it's getting a little more involved than that. Jeff, I'm trying to find this question here real quick. DSP, there it is. Hello. Yes. Thank you, Sarah, and then the folks at Depth. Registration question. Hey, how are you thinking about over attribution relative to the SK overlay, elevating impressions to a fidelity type 1 in the SKAN waterfall 30-day attribution window? Tangentially, how should brands navigate the loss of user signal with networks individually defining and justifying passing impressions as clicks on the MMP side with SK overlay signaling and engage view type as a click? This is a measurement problem, and it is a mess, and everybody does it different. And that's not a great answer. But Meta does it a little bit different. The great example, and I think most folks who even before SKAN on the Google like app campaign traffic, YouTube, if you get to that 6th second, at that point they start reporting clicks. You have the option to pull that in as engaged view, and that's sort of like this. But I think we all have seen apps, and I like to poke around sort of the SDK backed ad space a little bit and see what's sort of getting served out there. And what I'm observing, particularly on iOS, is an absolute slamming of taps. It is some ad units will pull up that app record, and then the timer starts, that closes. Anything you interact with on the screen pulls up another record. That's another tap that's reported. And I think the highest I've counted is like 11 taps within a single ad unit, which is wildly greedy and looks a lot like click flooding did back in the day. And unfortunately, click flooding back in the day, you would have at least enough aggregated signal on impressions and clicks and on installs that you could make a meaningful ratio. All that data isn't retrievable anymore. And so effectively, you just have to assert, well, if they say it's an engaged view, I can call it one thing. And if it's a tap, it's another. And if it's a straight impression, that's a third. Unfortunately, that's not going to work. It's not going to work because publishers have a little bit too much, I'll call it flexibility in there. And the ad units themselves are, for lack of a better term, really, really thirsty in terms of attribution. And I think you've seen this. So what do? I'm calling for standardization. And so we've been chatting with the IAB about this. And again, there needs to be some way to assert that an impression is an impression, and that a manual user action against an ad unit could be called something. And then very reasonable, there's a tweener state in terms of, I probably observed more, and that could be an engaged impression. But this everybody gets to call their own shots is an absolute train wreck for advertisers. And so quite frankly, what we've been doing is sort of standardizing at the brand level. And that might mean 2 different sort of integration types, even with the same network. And so that isn't really scalable either. But yeah, this is really perplexing for folks. We got some other questions here. Let me pull up another one. We got a couple questions on Android. If we have time at the end, I'm going to come back to these Android questions. Hey, the other thing I'll say is, we're looking at doing one of these a month here for a while. Happy taking requests also. We were thinking about the next one maybe is going to be incrementality. I'm fine doing one fully on Android because there's enough taking place over there that it probably warrants one. So to the extent that you guys have any requests, feel free to send them over. Let's see, Jeff, I'm looking for the question about, all the questions are sort of chunked on mine. Let's see, market trends. Yeah, let's look at this one. Let me show that guy. With Apple building their own DSP and possibly an SSP as well, what's the future for third-party ad platform to iOS? Yeah, this is the question, isn't it? This is wild. I mean, even though I'll ask you, yeah, what's going to stop Apple from pushing through the DSP world into the SSP world? Not much, I don't think. And the regulation, I don't see regulation stopping it, right? We can still think about the mobile scene as largely Google on Android devices. And so in terms of SKAN as a total, or app tracking transparency, or even iOS as a total worldwide, it's not that much. And so I don't see anything stopping Apple from pushing up through the DSP into the SSP world. And what would that look like? And so I'd mentioned, Kochava has 4,500 different network integrations. We have an Iron Source Android integration, Iron Source iOS integration, same thing with Jamf, same thing with all the integrated DSP partners. I see a world where Apple says, hey, good news, app loving publishers, you get to keep servicing Apple. You just have to sign up directly with us. You have to integrate directly with us, and they'll make it very pleasant, and it'll be a great sign up environment for publishers to start signing up directly with Apple. I don't see them not doing it. it's privacy safe. You know, as hard as this stuff is to measure, and as hard as it makes everybody's life, we all trust our personal data on Apple devices for a reason, right? I let it read my heartbeat all the time because I know it's not going to go anywhere. So, quite frankly, I think the future, specifically for Apple, is they've got a really nice lock on Apple Search. There's some really unique things you can do there that you can't do anywhere else. The StoreKit ad network, just the delayed nature alone, has shifted a bunch of dollars to ASA, and I see them expanding on it. Let's see. Let's grab another question here real quick. Jeff, I'll do a little time check. You can Slack me and see how we're doing. Let's see. We have SK overlay. Oh, privacy manifest. Yeah, this is an interesting one. I want to share this question. So Apple published a bunch of apps on sort of a, not really a naughty list, but this is a list of apps that need to change effectively. And it looked really, for lack of a better term, it seemed very preliminary. There were some really well-known SDKs on there, and there were some really obscure outliers. And so the spirit of it seems to be kind of attenuated to apps that collected PII and appeared to have some sort of addendum to another developer-focused communication. So I think there's going to be more coming out on this. It's this came out a bit ago and it hasn't really evolved. And so it would appear that it's PII focused, but at this point it seems to be kind of a mishmash. Let's see, we answered building their own DSP. We talked about privacy manifests. We talked about market trends. That was another question in terms of market trends. Let's get to the Android question real quick. This came in from some folks. Let me show this guy. What's your best guess for privacy sandbox for Android implementation date? And secondly, Google seems to be willing to share a lot more user information as part of their protected app signals API. That can be used for mobile app install ads or conversion, anything that's sort of post-install also. Is this enough to run existing AI and ML models from, or is the best still looking at incrementality? I don't know. I think the AI ML will play into the audience targeting and sort of the performative feedback loops, but incrementality is going to be the right way to look at it. Let's get into privacy sandbox real quick. What is that? Well, we've heard about Flocks and we've heard about Fledge and we've heard about sort of these audience things. But first off, when is this going to roll out? It's probably going to be Q4 of this year. And so we've been in great communication with Google. Actually feeling pretty good about this. There's some interesting things. At least I was on like an IAB call here a little bit ago, and they were talking about what's happening with Google and the G braid and all that right now. And it sounded like September is going to be the date. There's going to be also, it sounds like, some interesting tools afforded to developers as well. And Google has a heck of a lot more to lose, at least within sort of the mobile ad tech space, or at least just ad tech in general. And so they can't deprecate everything all at once. They have to be sort of thoughtful about the publisher community. And so within the app developers, it sounds like the app developers themselves are going to have at least somewhat of a bespoke say in audience definition and affinity types that they'll be able to target to within Android. And that'll be part of this privacy framework. And so that's sort of exciting. The other thing that I want to mention on Android is specifically on Android, strong recommendation for folks to use UTM parameters within their app tracking campaigns. Google within the Play Store and the Samsung Play Store and the Huawei Play Store all do the same thing, whereby if you write in a UTM campaign source medium creative, just that old UTM tracking stuff from DoubleClick way back in the day that largely describes Google Analytics. Those same UTM campaign source medium and creative get written to the app bundle and are available via the SDK to pull down. And so you can feed in click identifiers and impression identifiers and other identifiers over here and pick them up on this side. and still make a really, really good match without using device identifiers. So strong recommend that folks do that. However, link deprecation sounds like it might be a thing in Android. And so on that same call, I had asked the folks, like, do you guys intend to deprecate the UTM mechanism? And they said, well, we're going to get through this fall and then we'll start taking a look next year. And so what that tells me is the UTM will at least be around until probably the end of 25. And so lots of opportunities in there for folks to get visibility if you're not using UTM within your tracking tags. Cool. Any other questions? I'm going through our list here real quick. Jeff, we got any questions that came in real time? Yeah, this one, let me put this one up here real quick. Would love to hear about brands that are smaller advertisers that may not meet the thresholds of SKAN, and what are the alternative models of attribution? And so, yeah, this is a really, SCAD and AppTrackingTransparency is, if you're a developer is just getting off the ground and haven't reached scale, man, it's tough. And so how do you understand the ad spend? Well, the first part is to understand the first part of that equation, which is the spend. And we know that this is the way the world's going. We've all laughed at last click attribution for the last 10 years, yet it's been the model we've all used. We all know that incrementality is sort of the right question to ask in terms of, hey, what did the media actually do? What did the creative, what are my creative differences? Which campaign actually was more performative? And that answer changes if you look in the near term versus the long term. And so SKAN sort of makes that difficult also. But you do have two things that are really, really powerful. You have spend and you have conversions. And we acquired a company here about a year and a half ago called Machine for this sole purpose, understanding that attribution and measurement is going to get more difficult. How do we build an intuitive incremental measurement solution using novel inputs? And so if we think about AIM as a tool, you can find out more. We probably got some docs over here in the tab to find out more about it. But it takes cost by day, by publisher, by geo, by app. And then it takes conversions by those same metrics. And it needs a lot of back data to learn and understand, at least about 3 months, but more is better. And then it starts to cast a forward-looking contribution curve in terms of what your current spend is. And when we take that data and we back test it to say, well, how predictive was that 7-day forward-looking conversion curve? It looks to be about 95% accurate. And so what does that mean? It means that we're not using attribution signals of impressions and clicks anymore. We are using the input of cost and we're using the output of conversions to build an incremental measurement model. There's a lot here. It's a pretty powerful system. We're up and running with a bunch of folks right now, but I see that as being a viable tool for folks. A lot of it is that's fairly sophisticated, needs a lot of data, you need to feed the data. One thing I would do would just be literally testing partners one at a time. And even though that doesn't reach scale, if you're not seeing any sort of contribution increase based on running a single partner at a given time in isolation, that's probably a pretty good sign. So that would be my first strongest recommendation. All right. Jeff, any other questions here? Jeff, you want to pull one up? If we've got any live questions, you can just throw it up and we'll take it live. Oh, the September and December timeframe. Let me go to the deck here real quick. Yeah, let me see where we're looking here. September. Oh, I think we're probably. I think the probably asking about this guy. Let me pull this up here real quick. Oh yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. Here we go. Do entire screen. We'll share this guy. Yeah, so this one, what happened between the September and December timeframes? I think I had read this as this was, excuse me, you guys can't see it. There you go. There we go. Yeah, so I don't know whether we're meaning this one, which would put us sort of in here, because we had holiday and then we have sort of the holiday drop off. Versus here we have between September and December, which there wasn't a ton of movement. And then finally, we have right here, we have some publishers that are now implementing SKAN, which is even though, you know, we were implemented with SKAN back here, the publishers are finally starting to implement it on their sides as well. Oh, is the question what happens in Android? Yeah, what happens in Android is the privacy manifest actually rolls out. And so that gets implemented on Android devices. And so the privacy framework that Google's standing up, that's what is intended to roll out in September, in Q3 this year. Jeff, any other questions? Oh, yep, here we go. With SKAN iterations over the years, do you believe Apple's changes are making it look like you're getting more friendly with advertisers, or do you feel their tech and policy changes are self-serving for their own advertising aspirations? Or I'll add a third one in there, is their North Star is user privacy and everything else is a distant second. And I think that probably describes more. Now, I don't want to take Apple's inventory here, but I think they've sort of stumbled into cornering the market a bit with Apple search ads, largely because SKAN is such a new framework. It's moved a bunch of dollars into Apple search ads. But it's, you know, watch this space, man. It's going to be, it's either they're going to stand up more tools for a third party universe to start doing right by advertisers, or they'll start to absorb more of it themselves. You know, just the advertisers I'm talking to, it's not the world. It's only the folks I chat with, but advertisers feel like they're banging their head against a wall, quite frankly. And I think probably most any advertisers that's on this call is probably a bit frustrated. And so my hope is that we continue to roll out some tools that can unobfuscate this stuff, because it's not feeling more friendly. Ooh, what do we think Apple will release at WWDC? Yeah, I don't know. I'm often wrong. Yeah, I think broader private relay. I think we'll hear a big readout on all the private relay flips that have been, or switches that have been flipped this past year. I think we continue to see a continuance of that. Let me take this question back though to our devs, because I'd like to get a little bit bigger answer, because I know that we're holding some court with those guys, and we can come back with something a little more informed here. Yeah, so the incremental measurement tool I had mentioned was AIM, and it again uses cost and conversion, so app signals, as inputs, and then builds a model to set a forward-looking contribution curve at the publisher, creative, sub-publisher, site ID level. And so as long as we can understand cost by those metrics, we can understand performance by those metrics. And yeah, that tool's called AIM. I think we're going to open a poll here real quick. I'm sort of curious about this one. I threw some stats out at you earlier in terms of opt-in rates and things like that. And so let's see what the crowd looks like. Do you prompt for the app tracking transparency? Here come the votes. Not a lot of votes. I'm not sure we've reached what I'd call statistical significance. Yeah, most are no. Yeah, it sort of fits the pattern. We'll see, you know, well, some more votes are sort of floating in here. It follows the average. There's about a third now that are prompting, and about a third of the folks said yes. Oh, y'all are going to make a liar out of me. Everybody's going to start mashing yes. Well, cool. Hey guys, we're about at time. Let me wrap up with a couple things here real quick. Yep. So it looks like we're at the final. Yep. It's a third was no. A couple things. A lot of the work and most of the magic happens within the bit protocol of SCAD. So to the extent that you need to understand it, please reach out. That's where all this starts. The other thing I would say is in terms of all the bit protocols we've built, I think there's only been 2 that's used all 64 slots. So to that extent, most brands are leaving insight on the table. And so we can do a lot there. The other thing is, like I mentioned earlier, we will publish answers to all this stuff. I strongly recommend you look at the published answers. Sometimes the words that come out of my mouth are wrong, but we'll make sure that the answers that are in the written document are ones we stand by for sure. And we'll have fulsome answers for everything. So with that, if you've got any other questions in the meantime, you can send it over through that same invite and we can take those too. And then I guess we'll probably see folks at the end of February for the next one.